Welcome to the Institute of Governmental Studies in the Center on Politics. My name is Marc Levin, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Institute of Governmental Studies here. Today we are having our third in our series of election forums hosted by our Center on Politics at UC Berkeley. The first forum was on jobs in the economy, the second on terrorism and national security, and today we turn our attention to another vital topic in the election, values and social issues. We have two guests today. Very thankful to the participation of both our guests. Our first speaker will be Professor Kristin Luker. She has degrees from UC Berkeley and Yale University. Professor Luker was formerly a professor of sociology at UC San Diego before she was appointed to the faculty of the law school here and also sociology at UC Berkeley. Her publications include Taking Chances, Abortion and the Decision Not to Contracept, and Abortion and the Politics of Motherhood. Her research interests include gender, social demography, and medicine, and a critical review of social policies in all these three areas. Our second speaker will be Doug Strand. Doug received his PhD in political science from UC Berkeley. His dissertation was entitled Faith, Fear, and the Politics of Family Values. Dr. Strand's publications include Civil Liberties, Civil Rights, and Stigma, Voter Attitudes and Behavior in the Politics of Homosexuality. Besides his teaching here at Cal, Dr. Strand is project director of the Public Agendas and Civic Engagement Survey, PACES, located here on campus. Overall scholarly research focuses on public opinion, elections and voting behavior, cultural morality, politics, and the politics of religion. Today's program will be set up so that we'll first start with Professor Luker, who will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have Doug Strand talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have an exchange amongst our two panelists, and then open it up to the audience for question and answers. So I'm going to turn the program over to Professor Luker.
Great, thank you. Well, it speaks to how large Berkeley is that here's this terrific resource that I should have known about that I've just heard about. I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of the theory and raise some big intellectual questions, and I see, looking over my shoulder, that Professor Strand has brought some data to illuminate these questions. Let me begin by saying there's kind of a paradox in my field of sociology, and I believe in Dr. Strand's field of political science, and that is we all intuitively know that values make a difference in political behavior. As far back as 1972, they were talking about acid, amnesty, and abortion as being the things that kind of drove the election. This year we're talking about guns, God, and gays as things that are driving people to make electoral choices. But the scholarly literature, there's a huge literature that argues that, in fact, attitudes are not really polarized, that these value issues don't make very much difference. We know that there's been migration of social groups between, and to some extent among, but mostly between political parties. And again, I'm happy to talk more about this if you're interested, but let me just say that the work of my colleague Mike Hout in the sociology department, along with Jeff Manza and Clem Brooks, has shown that the base of the Republican Party and the base of the Democratic Party is quite different than it was, say, 50 years ago. That, for example, people in this room probably would have been 50 years ago or even 25 years ago that almost extinct breed known as a moderate or even a liberal Republican. Those people, by and large, don't exist anymore. And the people who are now core the sort of base of the Republican Party, that is, evangelical and, in particular, fundamentalist Protestants, probably in an earlier era would have been more likely to have found themselves in the Democratic Party. And people like Stan Greenberg, who was a pollster for President Clinton, for example, has shown in a book exploring this, that it largely was values that drove people, the so-called Reagan Democrats, out of the Democratic Party and into the Republican Party. And in essence, this kind of analysis draws on the fact that there are economic values, sort of pocketbook issues, and cultural or social or moral values, and that what we've seen over time is some switching of the importance of these and the movement of different groups into and out of different political parties. That is, social conservatives are disproportionately moving over into the Republican Party, and social liberals moving back into the Democratic Party. My own work touches on this in that I, in 1984, wrote a book called Abortion and the Politics of Motherhood, in which I argued that abortion had become a referendum on the status of women, and in particular on the status of motherhood. And one of the things that I was particularly struck by as I did my interviews, and I interviewed every pro-life and pro-choice activist that I could find here in California, was that many of the pro-life activists had in fact been Democrats. That when it came to sort of financial issues, they were much more identified in terms of class background and status group with the Democrats. But the political stance on abortion had driven them, of the party, had driven them out of the Democratic Party and into the Republican Party. My more recent work is on sex education. I have a book coming out next fall with W.W. Norton, tentatively entitled The Hidden Sexual Revolution, but I think it'll probably be changed before we actually go to press. And again, I'm struck by the fact that many of the people that I interviewed who were pro-sex education, and again I believe that the issues surrounding sex education are a referendum on women's roles, this time on the role of marriage rather than the role of motherhood. But many of the pro-sex education people that I interviewed were financially conservative. They weren't particularly liberal across the board. They were just liberal about sex. So I came to argue in that book that they're sexual liberals and sexual conservatives, and that they don't map neatly onto either foreign policy liberals and conservatives or onto economic liberals and conservatives. My big argument, if you want to know the big theory, is that there have been enormous changes in the lives of women over the last 50 years, with women increasingly moving into the paid labor force, and in particular women with young children working in the paid labor force. Women, of course, have always worked in this country, and women of color and poor women never really had the luxury of leaving the labor market. But for middle-class women, for the better part of the previous century before that, staying home had become the mark of a middle-class life, in part because a rising economy made that possible for a great many people. And of course, even then, middle-class women typically worked before they got married and after their last child had left home. What we began to see in the 60s and 70s, and more so up to the present, was that women began to think of themselves as full-time workers. They began to invest human capital in themselves, and they began to think of themselves as people who would work across a lifetime. My argument became that issues about sexuality and reproduction, abortion in the first case and sex education in the second, then become values issues that separate people on where they stand about these tremendous issues affecting women. That is, that if you look fondly back to a status quo ante and are in that sense anti-feminist, you'll tend these days to identify with the Republican Party. If you think that those particular changes are good ones and you support them and you find yourself in a social location where those changes are basically good for you, then you end up by and large supporting the Democratic Party. It's a little more complicated, and we can talk more about that. But in short, in the United States, as in much of the first world, we have evidence that values issues are driving politics much more than in previous elections. That pocketbook issues have, in some sense, declined in importance, while the so-called new social movements, the values issues, have become more salient. And the political scientist, for example, Ronald Inglehart, has called this culture shift, that there's an increasing political interest, whether it's the Greens in Germany or issues surrounding the veil in France or issues surrounding abortion and sex education in the United States, where sort of non-monetary or symbolic issues are the key to moving political votes. Not necessarily the key, but a key, an important key. Well, that brings me back to the paradox that I started with a few moments ago, and that is that despite the fact that you and I intuitively know that values are important in elections, and the media tells us unceasingly that values are important in elections, the scholarly literature, by and large, doesn't actually agree with that. And this is where we're beginning to talk about the so-called culture wars thesis. And I have some quotes here that I wanted to read you. In the 1992 presidential election, Pat Buchanan said, quote, "There is a religious war going on in this country, a cultural war as critical to the kind of nation we shall be as the Cold War itself. For this war is for the soul of America." Buchanan probably borrowed the metaphor of the culture war from a sociologist called James Davidson Hunter, who published a book of the same name a year earlier. And Hunter makes essentially the argument, taking it a bit further, I think, than I have, that values have become the only things that drive elections. A colleague of mine at Princeton, Robert Wuthnow, has gone on to point out that every major religion, with the possible exception of the Buddhists — I don't quite know what the Buddhists are up to — has fissioned into a liberal wing and a conservative wing, and that liberals have more in common with liberals in other denominations than they do with conservatives within their own wing. So, as Wuthnow argues, a liberal Protestant, a liberal Episcopalian, a liberal Catholic, and a liberal Jew have more in common with each other than they do with conservative members of their own denomination. So again, there's this idea that there's an overarching set of values that shapes how people respond to the world. Well, as I say, there's now a huge scholarly literature saying there's no such thing as a culture war, with sort of clever titles like "Are the Rumors of War Exaggerated?" or the "Being a Non-Combatant in the Cultural War." Another colleague at Princeton, Paul DiMaggio, has looked at public opinion data and shown by a number of different measures that American attitudes on everything of interest, these kinds of things that we've been talking about, sexuality, family values, and the like, have not become more polarized, with the possible exception of abortion. Nancy Davis, the author of this article, "Are the Rumors of War Exaggerated?" again shows that there are no huge differences. There's not a huge polarization in American public opinion. And the political science, Morris Fiorina, has shown, again, the same thing, that public opinions aren't more polarized. He even points out that DiMaggio, the differences he seems to find in polarization on abortion may be simply a function of how the question was asked. So let me bring it back again to this question. Why do we all intuitively think that there's that value issues make a huge difference, and by and large, the sociological and political science literature thinks that they don't, that they don't find evidence of issue polarization. Well, I think I have an answer, and I've been thinking about this for quite a while, partly in light of my new book. And I think the short answer is because sociologists, and forgive me, political scientists in this particular context, think of politics in a very atomized way, as if the only important unit of analysis, as sociologists say, would be the level of individual public opinion, that is, the attitudes that individuals hold. And a colleague of mine, whom I knew from Princeton, and I've managed to, here they are. I was going to say I'd managed to unarrange my notes, but in fact, here they are. A colleague of mine named John Evans, who's now at UC San Diego, did something very interesting. There was a special module in 1993 in the General Social Surveys that tapped values. And he took 2 items from this special module, and I'm going to read you both of the items. The first item goes like this. I'm going to read some statements that give reasons why a person's life turns out well or poorly. As I read each one, tell me whether you think it's very important, somewhat important, or not at all important for how somebody's life turns out. A, such things are decided by God. B, some people are born with better genes than others. C, society gives some people a head start and holds others back. D, some people use their willpower and work harder than others. E, it's just a matter of chance. When he went on to analyze it, he had to drop D because everybody agreed that some people just work harder than others. Second item was I did get a bit. They asked the question about the Bible. What is the Bible? And one response was, the Bible is the actual Word of God and is to be taken literally, word for word. And another response was, the inspired Word of God, but not everything in it should be taken literally, word for word. And finally, the Bible is an ancient book of fables, legends, history, and moral precepts recorded by men. So Evans took the 2 extreme positions here, that is that how your life turns out depends on God, and that the Bible is the actual Word of God and is to be taken literally word for word. And the other polar opposite, which is society gives some people a break and holds other people back, and that the Bible is an ancient book of fables, legends, history, and moral precepts recorded by men. And looked at these 2 groups, one group being the deeply religious, the other group being the secular humanists. And he found that the deeply religious, at least in terms of the data on the GSS, accounted for about 1/3 of the American population, and the secular humanists, the liberals, accounted for about 1/4 of the population, at least as measured by the GSS, and everybody else fell somewhere in between. So if you look at this rather clever analysis, it seems to me that we get a picture of 2 highly polarized groups on 2 ends of the continuum, and then a group of everybody else in the middle. And I think that's why so many people find that, on average, there's not a great deal of polarization. The problem being that I think this is a naive view of how politics works. That is, our political system, and those of you who are political scientists by background won't be particularly surprised, but our political system is exquisitely sensitive to highly mobilized small groups who care passionately about something, particularly in the face of a rather passive large group who cares a bit about something. And for me, the paradox of abortion is exactly this, and you find these same kinds of numbers, depending on how the wording is structured, somewhere between about 10 and 20% of the population has extreme pro-life or extreme pro-choice views, which means that 60% of the population doesn't doesn't have these polarized views. But to me, the more interesting figure is in these public opinion polls. If you ask people issues important to voters in this election, 25 issues important to voters, abortion almost always comes at 24 or 25. That is, it's not a terribly salient issue. But as we know from the very high effectiveness of the National Rifle Association, for example, you don't have to have wide public support in order to have political efficacy. And I think that's what we see on these issues that we've been talking about, which is highly mobilized people care intensively about sex education. They care about homosexuality. They care about abortion. They care about gay marriage. And they are people who are responsive to the political system in ways that the political system is responsive to them. Greg Adams, another political scientist, has shown that particularly with the issue of abortion, there's quite a good evidence of issue evolution. That is, surprisingly enough, up to 1980, Republicans were about as likely to be pro-choice as were Democrats. But over time, abortion became a litmus test for Republicans and subsequently for Democrats. And it became a defining mark of what the party was about. Adams thinks he can also show that the polarization, the partisan polarization on the issue of abortion did not lead but followed the congressional political partisanship on this issue. So I think what we find is that we have issues that mobilize people. They don't mobilize the whole population, but they mobilize a significant minority. They mobilize people to send money. They mobilize people to write letters to the editor. They mobilize people to write letters to their congresspeople. And I found in the abortion book that abortion advocates, more so pro-life people than pro-choice people, by the way, were much more likely to be bullet voters, that is, people who, particularly in the primaries, vote only on the abortion issue and overlook everything else. In fact, I had a question in my interview where I said, if a candidate who supported everything you supported except for the issue of abortion were running for office, how would you vote? And pro-life people almost uniformly said, I would vote against that person. Pro-choice people, I think because abortion is legal, and I did most of my interviews before Webster, would say, I might vote against that person. Moreover, as a graduate of the department here at Berkeley, Dwayne Oldfield has shown that people who care passionately about this issue are increasingly the sort of foot troops, the foot soldiers of the Republican Party. They're the people who ring doorbells. They're the people who stuff envelopes. They're the people who get out the vote. They're the people who, particularly through organizations such as churches, will drive caravans to make sure people get to the polls. So, in short, I think both of these views about values in politics are true. The average American voter is not particularly polarized along these value lines, but a small constituency, and not so small, 30% is not that small. And remember, 30% of the population in the GSS does not translate into 30% of the electorate. Those are actually two different sets. But they're mobilized enough to actually make a difference. And I think that leaves us where we are today, namely that in a political system where voters are increasingly de-aligned, it's important for candidates to turn out the base, which is what I think we're seeing in this election. So let me stop here, turn it over to you, and listen to your data.
Thank you very much, Professor Luker. I found quite a number of things in what you said interesting and was making a long list of things to comment on. So let me go to that after I present the results of some data that's pretty fresh, locally grown, and something which I think is very telling for what's going on in this election. The data that I'm going to be talking about is from a survey that is done out of the Survey Research Center, survey shop, which is near People's Park, and calling around the country since the middle of February to right this very moment. We have been asking about a wide range of agendas that the public has out there, trying to understand what the public agendas are, what their concerns are about the country, what's good, what's bad in the country, what the government should or should not do about those, what the level of participation, engagement is, so that we can see whether the squeaky wheels, the people that are most activated, have different views on things than the couch potatoes, people who are more passive, maybe don't even vote or vote and do nothing more, and how these agendas are coming into play in evaluating the candidates right now. And then we're going to go back to people after the election and find out how they voted. Right now we're just asking if the election were held today. We're also going to be asking some more religion and media questions to find out whether the Fox News cable news consumers are developing their opinions in a different way and are judging the election on a different basis from the network news people, for example. What I want to talk about here is, amongst all of the things we ask about, and we ask about everything on agendas pretty much, we focus on being as good in covering all the issues as possible. So we have race, we have immigration, we have free trade, but we have lots of stuff on family values, traditional family values. And here I'm going to focus on four things. One, attitudes towards the women's movement, discrimination against women, attitudes towards religion and politics, abortion, and homosexuality and gay rights. And I have put those together in one big measure that I'll be talking about, and just referring to it as family values, but really I mean traditional family values of those sorts. First of all, let me also start off by talking about religion and politics, because those, I taught a course called The Politics of Religion and Family Values. Those things are so closely linked that it's hard to talk about one without the other. I'm going to have to say that I'm one of those people, first of all, based on what Professor Luker was saying, that is in a minority but growing maybe to majority group in political science, which has been arguing that divisions in religion in the country are very important if you want to understand why people vote the way they do, particular attitudes that they have. There's been a small group that was kind of marginalized in political science for quite some time that claimed that religion was important, we should be paying attention to it, it's not just about money. And they have become more accepted and getting more publications in mainstream political science journals. And I think that the view that economic issues rules and culture doesn't matter much is fading, at least in political science. But I cast my vote strongly with those people that say it's very important. Wouldn't have done a dissertation about it if I thought it wasn't important. When we look at religion, first of all, I think it's important to try and see how this compares right now with other demographic, social cleavages in the country as far as dividing people in this election. And religion, whereas maybe in the early 60s and colleagues of mine, people that I know, Ken Wald and David Leahy and others in political science have argued that race used to be the big division, or economic issues, and that religion rose to become a major cleavage. What we find right now, if you look at the demographic groups that are usually looked at, race, education, economic class, membership in a union, and so forth, religion, if you want to ask one question, you want to ask people about their level of religious involvement. If you want to have the best predictor of where they're going to stand in this election, it is now not dwarfing, but it is beating out race, difference between blacks and whites, and where you're going to stand, at least right now, on who you're going to vote for, is less of a difference than the difference between a secular person, namely somebody that really doesn't have a religion, never goes to church, and somebody who believes the Bible's the Word of God, has no errors in it, goes to church a lot, and has religion subjectively is very important in their life. That difference is more important in a difference in who they're going to vote for than blacks versus whites. But let me give you the data, the latest ones from our survey, on the difference, the cleavage just between the seculars and these evangelicals that I talked about. amongst the people that have no religion, basically don't have an affiliation or involvement in religion, Kerry is ahead 61% to 24% for Bush. A huge gap there. The gap switches almost, it's a mirror image when you shift to the evangelicals, those that believe the Bible's the Word of God, have religion very important and are going to church a lot. There, it's Bush 68% to Kerry 18%. And so that cleavage is very strong. It's less so when you look at the mainline Protestants, those are not biblical literalists and so forth. When you look at denominations, it comes out much more clearly in Protestants as a whole when you put together mainliners and evangelicals than Catholics. There's talk about the Catholic vote and wondering which way they're going to go. Well, so far anyway, they are considerably behind where the evangelicals are in their support for the Republican ticket. And here I'm looking at those that are going to church a lot, very involved, religion's very important in their lives. Protestants, 70% support Bush. Catholics who are going to Mass a lot, very involved. Their religion is very important to them. 53% support Bush. It's a 20% margin over Kerry, but also note that amongst Catholics, those that are in that very serious Catholic space are a distinct minority of all Catholics. So when you look at Catholics that are not very involved, not going regularly to Mass and so forth, it's almost 50-50 in terms of the break between the two candidates. How does religion in particular compare with some of the other things that I've talked about in terms of the impact? If you want to take into account and control for all of the different sociodemographics, so you're taking into account whether somebody is rich, poor, old, young, married or not married, and so forth, moving from being secular to being one of these evangelicals is about a 47% difference in your vote for George Bush. Whereas if you are controlling for these other things, education and other things that play in with race, for example, that the difference between blacks and whites is about 37% in terms of when you look at a white person and then you look to an equally matched roughly statistically speaking, black person. The difference in what it makes in the vote is about 37% as opposed to 47%. And other things like gender, there is certainly is a gender gap when you don't control for whether people are Democrats or Republicans and look just at sociodemographics, but that's a 12% difference. So there you see how much the gender gap that people talk about a lot is just, it pales in comparison if you look at the gap between the seculars and those evangelicals that Hunter writes about. What about family values positions itself? Where does that come from? How does religion compare to other types of things? And again, religion is the dominant, overwhelmingly, of where people are standing on these cultural things. But there are other things that we should take into account as well. I divided up the opinions on this scale of family values, conservatism, liberalism, into liberals, moderates, and conservatives, just divided them into thirds. And just to give you an example of what religion is, those people that are not involved in religion, the percentage of people that fall into the most conservative third of that range, 14%. Versus 60% in the most liberal range. When you go to those that are highly involved in evangelical religion and biblical literalists, it's 73%. Instead of 13% conservative, it's 73% in the most conservative area. So it's making a big difference. But we are finding that education is still making the kind of difference that you would expect. It's not, there's an argument that the evangelicals are becoming more mainstreamed, more middle class, and so forth. It's not the old evangelicals chafe at a remark that was allegedly made by some Democrat that the evangelicals are uneducated and easily led. They didn't like to hear that at all. But you do see that there is, in addition to what a difference religion makes, that education is making a large difference in where people stand on these traditional family values issues, so that non-high school graduates, 45% are in the most conservative. They're the plurality location there, versus graduate school, 17%. You move across it, and it just kind of goes down in conservatism as you move up in education pretty monotonically. Age is very interesting, and I think that is something that has implications for what the Republican Party is going to do and the Democratic Party is going to do in the future. We tend not to see that people get more conservative on cultural issues as they age. There's not a whole lot of that when people have looked at it by cohort versus age effects. And so when you see a difference that is in age, where the youngers are more liberal than the olders, then that is something where you expect it's going to transform society as a whole as the older folks die off and the younger folks become a larger percentage of the population. You assume that it might continue the same, or at least not get any more conservative as the next youngest generation comes into the whole pool of adults. Those people that came of political age, kind of in the New Deal era, 43% of them are in the conservative camp on these traditional family values. Those Generation Y folks, and we oversample youth, so we've got more than a few to talk about there. Those Generation Y who kind of only have been involved in politics during George Bush's administration, it goes down from 43 for these oldsters down to 23 in the conservative camp, and their liberalism predominates amongst the divisions of the thirds in conservative and liberal there. So I would suggest that this should give the cultural conservatives, strategists, the Ralph Reeds of the world pause, wondering what are they going to do as this looks like it's going to fade as, to some degree, as an issue where conservatism has punch. Liberalism will gain some relative to conservatism over time as the population is replaced by younger folks, unless suddenly there's a conservative wave and Generation Z becomes much more conservative. Now I want to turn more particularly to the vote. How much is family values, traditional family values, mattering? Professor Luker was setting it up with evidence from the consensus in political science, or the predominant view in political science and sociology, that data doesn't matter much, and a piece of evidence that's adduced to suggest that things like abortion and family values politics don't matter much in maybe the most important single political act, how somebody votes. But the problem is that I and my colleagues Miro Shanks strongly caution against taking as informative, highly informative, what people say as far as indicating what is really important to them. So that you will ask people, and it's done every week in every poll, what is the most important issue that's going to affect your vote this year? And economy, and Iraq, and terrorism, those three things tend to jockey. Healthcare might be coming up a little bit. And you have something like abortion, which is way down the list, and gay rights, which is way down the list, and nobody's mentioning the role of women. And, the lack of God in the schools is also way down the list. They're all way down the list. But when you look at where people stand on these issues, on that index that I talked about, and where they're actually, what their preferences are for who's going to vote, and you take into account their other attitudes in statistical analysis, these attitudes towards traditional family values are very divisive for the election of '04, and it's happened like that in previous elections in '92, for example, to some degree in '88 and '84. Before that, as Professor Luker suggested, there was an evolution in that the parties were not emphasizing that, it wasn't as divisive. But right now, when you look at it and compare it with the impact of other issues on how people are going to vote and control for these other issues, you find that Iraq is number one, clearly, where people think, whether they think it was a mistake or not, and whether we got serious problems over there. But second on the list, and doing quite powerfully, is the attitudes towards traditional family values. That is what is dividing the electorate in where they stand in voting for preferring Bush or preferring Kerry. And it is about equal with all these economic issues, taxes, aid to the poor, health care, education, things that have been what political scientists have thought has been more important traditionally. So it's not correct to say that it has eclipsed these other issues, I don't think. But it is about as important right now, these cultural issues, as economic concerns. What do you want the government to do, liberal or conservative, on economic things? And this is not something that you'll hear about in the newspaper. It's very interesting. They talk about how the religious right, so to speak, is going out and mobilizing people in the pews and so forth. And but on the other news stories will say, here's our list of what matters, and we don't see abortion and these other things don't seem to be catching on. That is because the way it is measured and assessed, we think is the wrong way to go about it, and profoundly misleading. I want to talk about what it means when you just look in more concrete terms with what family values, conservatism or liberalism means for your vote inclination right now. And we'll just look at it for what it does in breaking off Democrats or breaking off Republicans, the so-called wedge capability. And when you look at the liberals in the Democratic Party, from one end, liberals on traditional family values who are Democrats, about 7% of those are voting for George Bush. Not a big surprise. But if you move to that third of the public as a whole, and it's maybe a quarter of Democrats who have the most conservative range of attitudes on traditional family values, George Bush gets almost a third of that vote. Of course, there are other things that are in there that correlate, that go along with these things. So it's not all that, but there is a substantial piece that can be broken off from each party based on their attitudes on these cultural politics things. On the Republican side, I would say that there's somewhat less. I'm not going to do the somewhat less of a break-off potential going on there. But amongst Republicans who are conservative on traditional family values, 98% of them are voting for George Bush. It's just, don't even bother with them. But amongst those liberals, and again, it's roughly equivalent to in the Democratic Party. About a quarter of the Republican Party is in the liberal camp on these issues. A quarter of the Democrats are in the conservative camp, quarter of the Republicans are in the liberal camp. And there, instead of 98%, it goes down to Kerry is getting, instead of 2%, Kerry is getting 21%. So that's why both parties want to work these issues, and it's tricky for Democrats. It's not, I haven't read the book about what's wrong with Kansas. I don't know if you've looked at that or not, but I know that is about, how could these people be possibly voting against their economic interests and so forth. Well, there is a substantial power to the appeal of these values that is able to chip off people that have gone over to the Democratic Party for economic reasons in the past, and chip off Republicans who've gone over for economic reasons because of liberal appeals. Let me close by my planned presentation here by asking, is there any difference in particular groups and where the divisions on family values in the election are more acute than in others? One thing that you might have thought is the case, but you need to take into account, and it bolsters the role of religion, and that those people are not going to church at all, even though there are cultural conservatives amongst those people. It is having much less of an effect on who they decide to vote for than the people that are activated, that are engaged. And that would fit in with what you were saying about how the importance of elite mobilization and shaping things. If you hate gays, for example, but you're not going to church, you're not involved in it at all, you're much more likely to pay attention to some other issue, Iraq, the economy, or something. It takes being in an environment where it's emphasized, and maybe given a divine transcendent connection. That's unclear, but that's what gives religion even more punch than just the differences in where people stand on the issues. It gives it much more punch in how much it matters. I looked at differences between men and women. There's been a lot of literature on the role of gender in attitudes towards these issues, as Professor Luker was talking about, also in gay rights. But I didn't find that the division of opinion in terms of it mattering in the election was different for men or women. That was not a difference. But I did find it interestingly amongst youth, that youth were taking into account their position, conservative or liberal, on where they stand on these issues when they considered who they were going to vote for, who they would like to vote for, much more than people who were middle-aged and older. And that can make sense from perspective that people are shaped by what the conflicts are during their socialization period. And older folks were socialized to politics when economics and race mattered, and younger folks are much more in their formative period being exposed to debates over abortion and gay rights and so forth. So it's not the case that, although it is the case that younger folks are more liberal on these attitudes, they're still quite engaged with them, and even more so than older folks. And on some of the things that Professor Luker talked about, I guess I had a few comments. There's what the meaning of this religion effect is, I think, is poorly explored. So you can grant that there is a religious difference, but how much of it is really about differences in transcendent worldviews versus differences in just where social groups and elites tend to focus their organizing, where traditionalism, people from traditionalistic backgrounds tend to hang out in churches, so it might not be as overwhelmingly about God and what God says as people expect. If people are not going to church and socializing with other people that are traditionalist, then even though they might have the same beliefs, they are not translating that belief about God into what they think politics should be about. So I get very bothered by talks about people of faith, Republican or people of faith or Democrat. I don't think we really know well enough to say that it is their religious devotion that is leading them to try and do what they think is God's will in politics. There are so many other factors that have to be assessed there that go along with that fact that people are more devoted to the Bible than others. It's not just about God that's doing it. So the slogan that I saw in Berkeley, "God save us from your followers," is maybe not as apt in applying it to judging what's behind Jerry Falwell and so forth, as people tend to give it weight in the news. Finally, I guess, because I'm probably running out of time, and we can talk a lot more about this during the give and take and Q&A, but I think that it needs to be hypocrisy issues need to be addressed. And this is where I guess I take a little bit of a normative perspective, that why is it the case if evangelicals are so concerned about doing the will of God, why is it focused on sex, abortion and sex and the role of women, and why do I find that inequality issues matter much less to evangelicals when they decide who to vote? And why is it focused on these other issues? There is certainly plenty of religious argument for adding concern about inequality and poverty as part of the Christian tradition, and not just concern about staying chaste or having babies. So why is it a focus on one rather than the other? That in itself does not sound like a religious effect. It's more of maybe a self-interest effect, because the people that you can focus on in the cultural politics are usually not you, whereas economic issues hit your pocketbook. So that is something that I think needs to be paid attention to and brought into the dialogue, so that if we're going to have a society that's divided by religious worldviews, maybe each side could take the other into account in calling each other on cases where it's not consistent in the flip-flop type of mood of today. Thanks.
Thank you. That was very informative. I wonder, do you have any comment on Doug's material?
Well, I have two comments. One is, I hope you didn't hear me saying that religion wasn't important. I think it's incredibly important. And in particular, what, as your comments made clear, what sociologists call religiosity, that is how often you go to church, how involved you are in your religion, it is very, very powerful. And it's also the case that both sociology and political science have tended not to pay too much attention to religion. There was sort of a secularization thesis out there that somehow believing in God and religion was left over from the pre-modern era, and as we became post-industrial, that was going to sort of wither away. And I think we've seen exactly the opposite. The point I wanted to make, and I draw this from my own interviews, which are not generalizable to the population as a whole, but I think I've found some evidence in the literature that supports me. Sociologists tend to think of religion as a static thing. you're born an Episcopalian, say, and you stay an Episcopalian. What I found in my interviews, and again in some other data, is that increasingly religion is a consumer good for people. That is, they self-select into a religion because they see it as representing the values that they feel are being challenged. So, and it's not surprising to me that gender is this big division around which people are mobilizing, because like race in an earlier generation, it's truly a revolution. There really has been a revolution in gender relations. And in every revolution, there are winners and losers, and in some sense what we're doing is fighting over again the sexual revolution of the 1960s. And what I'm finding, again in my interviews, but I think I'm finding touches of evidence elsewhere, is that people choose a religion precisely because of the family value stance of the religion. They aren't necessarily born into it. Some people are. But people are always exiting out of and entering into religions, and they do so, I think, in large part based on these family values.
If I can follow up on that, that is something that I talked about in my dissertation as one factor that is other than this idea of you follow God, you devote to God what God wants and the metaphysics of your religion, and then you bring those into politics. It's that your initial political views on what you think of gays or the role of the sexes and so forth is affecting whether you're going to find biblical literalism as a satisfactory place to land or not. And so the causality which people give to faith affecting politics is more politics affecting faith.
Well, now we're going to turn ourselves over to a question and answer session, but I'm going to take the first question as a prerogative of the moderator. And I'm wondering, in this election, we are seeing a relatively new issue emerge, and that is stem cell research. And since it does have some moral implications, I'm wondering if both of you have any opinions or thoughts on that.
I will defer to you on the data.
Well, we just started asking that when it looked like it was going to become a major issue in the campaign. So we haven't yet really looked at that data because we hadn't gotten enough interviews done with that question in there. We've only been asking it since June or so. But my suspicion is that when we look at it, we will find that it will be another type of issue on top of abortion, but just in addition to somebody's traditional abortion viewpoints, that stem cell research will have independent punch in predicting whether somebody preferred Bush or Kerry. And I think that that is because the percentage of people that favor a greater funding for stem cell research from the federal government is about 75-80% of the public, that I think that George Bush is going to take a hit on this issue that'll be noteworthy.
I just forgot what I was going to say. Hold on. Professor Strand was saying there's a debate in the literature about how religion works its way with people, whether it's something about the faith or something about the experience of being religion, or whether it's simply a community effect. But one thing that's clearly important, again from my interviews, is a lot of people don't know very much about stem cell research, and it matters if you belong to a community that says stem cell research is exactly the same thing as abortion, and if you're opposed to abortion, you must be opposed to stem cell research, so that organizations such as churches become, or conversely, if you belong to a liberal, say Protestant denomination, you're likely to hear either your minister or perhaps your other people in your congregation saying stem cell research is the wave of the future, it's the way we can deal with all these chronic diseases. If you believe in science, you must believe in stem cell research. So that these other organizations such as churches become transmission belts for information that then help people make political decisions.